I'm Victoria Jimenez. I'm head of sector in charge of urban development at the Union for the Mediterranean. Welcome everyone to this webinar on Euro-Mediterranean cities in the post-pandemic that the Union for the Mediterranean is co-organizing together with UNESCO, basically in the form of a conversation with Professor Richard Sennett. Before we start, I just wanted to remind you that we have French translation available. You may be able to see the options somewhere in the bottom part of your screen for those of you who may need it. And also, I would like to remind you that the webinar will be organized as follows. At the beginning, we will have two brief interventions from the co-organizers, the Union for the Mediterranean and UNESCO, to frame the discussion. And then we will start what is basically the core of the session, that is a conversation in the form of an interview conducted by Jyoti Hofstadter, Deputy Director of the World Heritage Center at UNESCO, to Professor Richard Sennett. More or less for about an hour, and after that we will open the floor and we will be collecting questions from the audience through the chat. I'm sure that most of you know Professor Sennett very well, but for those of you who might be not that familiar with him, the session could be, in fact, a good opportunity to discover him. He is an urban sociologist. He is a senior advisor to the UN on climate change and cities. He is also teaching at Columbia University and the MIT. But I would say that above all these positions, he is one of the greatest urban thinkers, if one can say that nowadays. And that's why it's a great pleasure for us to have him here today. So without further ado, let's start the session. And to do that, I will give the floor to the UFM Secretary General, Nasser Kamel. His Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'll start by greeting Professor Sennett, of course, and of course, Madam Deputy Director, and all the ladies and gentlemen participating in today's event. It's indeed an honor for me and a privilege to welcome all of you in this event, but especially I want to express my deep appreciation to Professor Sennett for being with us today. I'm aware that his lifelong groundbreaking work on sociology of cities, communities, and culture has been really an inspiration for everyone working in the field. The Union for the Mediterranean, as you all know, is the intergovernmental organization that is grouping 43 member states, the member of the European Union, and 5 southern and eastern Mediterranean countries. It aims and tries to contribute to regional stability in terms of human development and also enhancing regional integration across the whole spectrum of the Euro-Mediterranean region by promoting first and foremost dialogue and cooperation. We do perceive ourselves as the regional hub for the United Nations Agenda for Sustainable Development, and trying to timely and effectively draw upon best practices in Europe and beyond so our region can advance in that direction. We are all aware that time is of the essence for us worldwide, but especially in the Mediterranean when it comes to the challenge we're facing in terms of climate change and in terms of what the region is facing in that particular field. We have worked during the last couple of years in cooperation with the World Environmental Programme by supporting a group of 85 scientists from the region and beyond to study the impact of climate change on our region. And the results, to say the least, were alarming. We all know that the Mediterranean, in terms of the temperature increase, has surpassed the 1.5 degree centigrade agreed during the Paris summit. We also know that if we don't take the necessary mitigation and adaptation measures, by 2040, the temperature increase could be 2.2 degrees centigrade and possibly maybe 3.8 degrees in some part of the basin by 2100. So we are facing a climate emergency in our region that could very well aggravate existing problems of sustainable development in the Mediterranean, and notably, because this is the subject of today's discussion, our cities. We know our cities will be facing immense challenges in terms of the impact of climate change. We know that 10 of the 20 most affected cities in the world by climate change will be Mediterranean cities. We know that some of the mega cities in our region could face grave risk of flooding due to sea level rise. That's why I think, in terms of climate emergency, our cities are at the center and forefront when addressing this phenomenon, because they are where most of our population lives, and they are our first line of defense. And our mandate and all our endeavors is working towards that goal. Now we have an added challenge, which is the challenge posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, which in my view is a wake-up call for us to give more priority to science-led proactive vision for our region. Policies and practice should help all of us raise awareness about and alleviate existing and emerging risks for sustainable human and urban development. We are supporting, as I said before, this assessment report on the climate change impact in the region, but we also are working very diligently to finalize a science-led and integrated UFM strategic urban development action plan for sustainable, resilient, and inclusive cities and communities in the Mediterranean. And thanks to a very active collaboration with the Delft University of Technology, and also, of course, the European Commission and UNESCO World Heritage Center, we will be able to present to you some conclusion by the end of this year. This webinar today will give us an opportunity to draw upon the extensive experience and knowledge of Professor Sennett in indicating for us who works in the field the way forward in science-led urban development at a time when, as I mentioned, are facing a global pandemic and the region is facing a climate emergency, and we must keep on working to achieve the sustainable development goals in our region. So I will not speak further, and I think it is time for me now to thank you and to give the floor to dear Deputy Director. I hope I'm not mispronouncing your name, Huza Grahar, who is co-hosting and chairing this meeting on behalf of the World Heritage Center at UNESCO. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Kamal. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure working with the UFM. Ambassador, Professor Sanet, colleagues, the ongoing health crisis due to the COVID-19 has brought sharply into focus the fragility of our cities. We stand at the crossroads to consider pathways to recovery and enhance the resilience of people everywhere. In light of these new challenges that the current health crisis has presented to cities worldwide, we need to rethink urban heritage for resilience and recovery. Cities focused on the importance of engaging with local communities and their well-being. Some of the cities have in these past months used spaces for emergency responses, setting up virtual platforms for sharing heritage, and experts have proposed innovative approaches to help cities from this situation. And the solutions have ranged from a great deal of virtual productions of different types to engagement of different types of financing, including governments that have been making a lot of promises on helping cities. And the question of inequality, of course, with the marginalized communities have been also brought to the fore, looking at transportation, what it means in the current situation when people prefer at the moment to look at pedestrian bicycle-friendly transport, and even considering supporting digital tourism at the moment when tourism has more or less come to a halt. And cities in the Euro-Mediterranean basin have been hit hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, impacting the vibrant and thriving cities and streets. Recent accelerated climate change that Ambassador Kamal referred to has exacerbated existing environmental problems in the Mediterranean basin that are caused by a combination of changes in land use, increasing pollution, and declining biodiversity. Furthermore, the rich cultural heritage of the Euro-Mediterranean cities are expressions of the region's identity, as well as the incredible cultural diversity. The historic urban centers are important repositories of memories and the knowledge of previous epochs of identity, where previous pandemics have all left marks in urban architecture. Cultural heritage is also an important resource that offers solutions and alternative models for sustainable urban development. The webinar today, we hope, will reflect upon what marks this pandemic could possibly leave on your Mediterranean cities and how this needs to be taken into account in building a common vision for sustainable urban development and for the decades to come. The pandemic also challenges urbanists and planners to rethink the architecture of density and reimagining cities that are walkable, have green open space, and recognize the power of local communities. So we believe it would be important to use this moment of crisis to rethink the importance of place and identity and furthering sustainability and resilience. The Euro-Mediterranean region has a large number of World Heritage cities and numerous other cities with valuable urban heritage and just a lot of World Heritage in general. The importance, so we really believe in the importance of integrating protection of urban heritage in solutions for sustainable urban development. Whether we're looking at housing or public space, we can do this in line with the UNESCO 2011 recommendation on the historic urban landscape. The historic urban landscape is the urban area that we can understand as a result of a historic layering of cultural and natural values and attributes extending beyond the notion of historic center or ensemble to include the broader urban context and its geographical setting. This could include topography, morphology, etc. but also the local communities, the natural heritage around, the setting, visual relationships, and the land use patterns, spatial organization, and other elements of the urban structure. It also includes the social and cultural practices and values, the economic processes, and the intangible dimensions of heritage as related to diversity and identity. So as we move, recover, and rebuild cities, we must place heritage at the heart of urban solutions that engage people, recognize their cultural diversity, and draw on a storehouse of local, place-based solutions rooted in traditional knowledge to make cities sustainable, resilient, safe, and inclusive. Even as we long to return to normality, UNESCO has launched a new initiative on the next normal, challenging us to reflect critically on what we have come to accept as normal. What is the normal we long to return to in our historic cities? Can we imagine an alternative to ever-increasing mass tourism, escalating the exclusion of local communities for the benefit of commercial development, rampant and uncontrolled development that forever pits heritage conservation against urban development? Or can we imagine other futures, the next normal for historical centers, for cities in the Euro-Mediterranean region? So I will stop here and just open up the conversation with Professor Sennett. Let me welcome you, Professor Sennett. It's a delight to have you join us here today.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Ambassador Kamal, for opening this discussion. I am delighted that we talk about the issue of heritage in relation to climate change, because it's something very much on the minds of myself and my colleagues, that simply scraping, as it were, scraping the blackboard free of the past is not really a way to address the problems of the future. So I'm very glad that you've invited me. I should say that I'm speaking for myself. The work I do for the UN is largely focused on a new cross-UN initiative called the Council on Urban Initiatives, set up through UN Habitat to promote a kind of intersectional discourse within the UN about cities, to get people out of their silos. And more than that, to be a kind of think tank that focuses on the long term and on big problems rather than on immediate crises. And I will post on a website, if I can, how you can be in touch with us. And we're new. We've just been set up with the blessing of Antonio Guterres, Secretary General. So we're just getting started, and we welcome as much contact as we could from colleagues at this point. I guess just to get the discussion going, I'd like to make 3 comments. And the first is about the whole question of how urban heritage translates into the problems that we are facing in the future with climate change. And it's a problem that really focuses on density. The cities, heritage cities, and particularly cities around the Mediterranean, were places in which the city focused, in which density was a good. It was a place where in ancient times people could protect themselves from the countryside. When there was war, they would go within the cities. But more enduringly, it was a place in which you got agglomeration effects by people who did the same kind of work being close together so that they could both compete and cooperate. And as we know, that agglomeration effect, that kind of concentration, is a way of stimulating urban growth and economic growth in particular. It is, for thousands of years, the notion of concentrating people together to compete and cooperate at the same time is what's made markets work. It's why Silicon Valley is today full of corporations and startups which are all together, in which people have a need for going to conventions rather than just working online. And when we began thinking about the long term, about how cities could address climate change, what we were minded to do is look at what patterns of agglomeration from the past, of densification, might hold lessons in terms of urban form for dealing with climate change in the future. It was very focused for us on the question of how to reformat the tower in the park model, which begins with work of Corbusier and the Plan Voisin in the 1920s, which disaggregates, which is dense in a way, but it's a disaggregated kind of densification, that you have people isolated into towers, communicating, as Corbusier thought, by pneumatic tubes. Now they do it by electronically. And what we understood about this is that this kind of tower in the park model, which dominated 20th century planning, was, in terms of climate change, highly dysfunctional. And we have just begun, it's very energy intensive. It invites people to use cars to get to these towers. And it diminishes a lot of the agglomeration effect of face-to-face encounter. So the work we have launched looking to the future is how could we understand forms of density that are in more climate friendly, if you like, less resource using than this dominant model since the time of Corbusier, which has influenced planning throughout both the developed and the developing world. When the pandemic struck, we had, of course, to have a rethink about the plan that we, or the way of thinking we were looking forward at. That is to increase density and to find ways of understanding relatively low use, energy use resources as they've been architecturally developed in the past as models for something in the future. Because the logic of the pandemic on a lot of forms of urban populations is that density is a threat. It seemed as though the capacity to deal with this emergency could not be squared with the capacity to deal with the long-term emergency, which requires ever more and more densification. And so that is the issue that we're trying to explore now. How to square the relationship between practices which ensure a sustainable urban future long-term and practices which, more short-term, seem to push density in an opposite direction.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's a fantastic sort of introduction right there, because you've laid out right up front. Let me ask you, just to backtrack a little bit, where were you when this lockdown happened? You know, it sort of came upon us rather suddenly, in a sense. And
where was that person?
Went from one day to the next, everything had changed. And where were you, and what was your experience of the city? And, you know, I want to hear a little bit about what you thought transformed dramatically in a matter of days.
Well, I was in London, and this beautiful flat that you see behind me is actually in the midst of an industrial area. Perhaps you can hear it. It's an old print factory. My study doesn't look that way, but that's what it was when I bought this. So the lockdown for us was an economic crisis in this neighborhood, because suddenly all these factories shut down. But it was not a habitation crisis in the sense that lots of people live here. And it's been like a ghost town. I'm in a part of London called Clerkenwell. And it's true that, you know, the cafes that serve workers and so on are shut. But what we didn't experience, which people elsewhere I'm sure did, was the extraordinary effect on family life of the lockdown. What we experienced was a kind of economic ghostliness. And which is now, when I can recognize that the city is coming back to life, the noisier the machines around our house are.
Well, I think that's absolutely true. And things went very silent, but we also had in Paris many families who went to other parts of France, for example. You know, but we also have this kind of, I feel it brought us a strange situation with regard to what we see as global and what we see as local. Because modernity has often, you know, what you're talking about, the CIAM and the sort of modernist view, modernity has been referred to as a kind of a space-time compression. And, you know, where the lockdown, in a sense, altered this idea of space-time compression, because all of a sudden people went from being very global to being very limited, you know, with cancellation of flights, closing of borders, you know, even closing of neighborhoods. You know, people became much more local. They started to even meet their neighbors for the first time in many instances. But at the same time, there was a plethora of virtual ways to connect globally. So it sort of transformed this global-local relationship. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, what you said is very, personally, very, very true. I haven't been on a plane in 3 months, and it's quite a different experience for me. One thing I would say about this, and maybe expanding your question a little, if I might be, is that one of the fantasies that people have had about the effects of the pandemic is that it's going to be possible for people to disaggregate workplaces, work from home, that the spatial dimension of actual space is going to be abrogated by changes in the way people work. It is, to me, very dubious, and I'll tell you for two reasons. One of them has to do with inequality, which is that people who can't spatially distance are working class people. That's true all over the world. You can't collect garbage online. You can't be a nurse online. You can't be an undertaker online. And I think if we do have this disaggregation of work so that the office disappears as a site, it only means that in cities, we're going to make more evident the relationship, the distances between the classes. In terms of COVID, that's a very, very serious matter because it's the working classes who are increasingly exposed to the disease. They have nowhere to hide. There's nowhere to go. There's no country house where they can go. If they go back to their villages, they don't have work. So that's one aspect of this. The other, I'm sorry, I'm taking your question a little beyond what your comment is. The other aspect of this is that it's not as though people have discovered working from home for the first time. This is something that began in the 90s. It was in the 90s greeted by particularly women workers that they could combine work and family by working from home. And what they found was that working from home meant that the tasks they were doing were more and more regimented. They didn't have what's sometimes called the water cooler effect of having informal relations with others face to face. They were given tasks to do rather than generating them. So that what looked like kind of liberation for gender has, and the data on this is very robust, meant that there was a new kind of digital ceiling for workers who worked at home, and particularly women. The other thing that the last 30 years has shown us, and the data on this is also very robust, is that over time, working from home is less productive than working in an office face-to-face with other people for some of the same reasons, that there's not the stimulation of informal relationships. I guess if any of you have been addicted to Zoom the last 3 months, you will have, I don't need to explain this any further. But the consequence of this is that what the strategy of coping with the pandemic is not sustainable. It's not sustainable in terms of class, in terms of gender, and certainly not in terms of economic productivity. So I'm very unhappy when journalists say, oh, that's the future is working from home. That's a very bad prospect. And as urbanists, we should not take this short-term coping mechanism as something that's desirable as a best practice for us looking forward.
Absolutely, point well taken. But one could also, just to play the devil's advocate for a second, flip it around to look at historically the examples of, you know, the way that guilds worked, for example, or shop houses, and you have, you know, home, and then the small production, the artisanal production that happened, the ateliers that were right next to the home. So the entire family, you know, even children, women, all involved in the same work. So they didn't have a water cooler, so to say, to go to, you know, there's a very different mode of production. And I don't know if you see any lessons that one could draw from something like that. Where do you think we go from here? How can you think about the well-being of cities, of communities?
Well, one thing that has very much struck me positively, and I said as an individual, not on behalf of any organization, is Anne Hidalgo's proposals for Paris to make, to decentralize it into 15-minute cities. I think this is a brilliant idea, that Paris would, in effect, become a series of mini cities in terms of its current density, but that places where you could cycle or walk to within 15 minutes from where you live. That's not a replication exactly of the old guild model where you lived where you worked, but it's a way of dealing with the fact that looking to the long term, that there is an upper limit to the amount of central city concentration that we can afford in terms of climate change. You know, the model, it takes us again back to Mediterranean city, a city like Marseille or Tunis or Beirut, where I worked for many years. It takes us back to the notion of scale, that scale and density aren't the same thing. You can have relatively small scale cities of 200,000, 300,000, 400,000, which are very dense. And what's happened, as we all know, to the cities today is that we're having a decrease in, the scale is expanding rapidly, but in places like Mexico City, the density is diminishing. It's, people can't, the 15-minute city is a dream for people in Mexico City. They're in cars 2 or 3 hours to go to their work. So one of the ways forward, it seems to me, is to find a way to make more medium or smallish cities, which are not, nonetheless, which are not suburbs, which actually have a center, which have some of those benefits of people being close to where they live and work, which are connectable. I want to say, if I could, just one thing about that as a sociologist. One of the things that's happened in 20th century urbanism is that as you had an increase in scale, you also had an increase in social segregation. If you lived in a 19th century, 18th century city like Tunis or like Paris, the rich and the poor lived quite close together. By 1980, mixed communities were in sharp decline. The old notion even of the Haussmannian boulevard, where you stacked people by classes vertically, was gone. And the scale, as the scale increased, there was more and more economic and social isolation. As an urbanist, this really seems to me a grave, grave crisis for cities. If you don't live and work with people who are different from yourselves, things like toleration, avoidance of ethnic conflict, violent upheaval goes up. And so one of the things I think we can learn about some kind of the kind of cities that UNESCO protects, not all of them, but some of them, is how people who were so different were able to live close together. And that's a knowledge we need for the future. And to do that, I think we need to reduce the scale of urban development rather than keep building stretched out places which segregate people more and more.
Thank you. Yes, absolutely. And I think you've talked before and more recently as well about the idea of uses of disorder, where everything doesn't need to be perfectly controlled and put in place in this kind of a orthogonal way, I think. And certainly historic cities are places which have been, you have many models of density. You have models, as you say, which are tall, but you also have models which are very tightly packed.
Right.
But what does this pandemic do to us in terms of thinking? We're now all focused on the idea of distancing. And how do we then adapt to the idea? What is the new notion of density that we can take away? Where do you think the Euro-Mediterranean cities, for instance, should they be looking at decreasing density? I mean, you just said they should increase density. But on the other hand, there's also the idea that it's less, in terms of health and security, it's perhaps needs to be diminished a little bit, and the distance put in there. So how do we?
Well, I would say they need to decrease scale, but not density.
Could you explain that a bit more?
Well, I mean, the benefits of density are so great that to build cities which are like suburbs or isolated would be, for the sake of not getting sick, would be a mistake. And I say that for a reason. I am sure that we'll find a vaccine within a year or two. There's an amazing effort that's going on throughout the world. Despite President Trump, the World Health Organization is doing incredibly impressive work in coordinating this. Once we have a vaccine, we have something really, like, even if it's short term, like a flu vaccine, we have something which changes the game of how we relate to each other. And so would, in the meantime, reconfiguring social distance, so on. But say we have a vaccine in 2 years, and we've embarked on a 10-year program of de-densifying cities. Year 5 or year 6, we'd say, wait a minute, we're building for the past. We should be looking forward. And so what I resist is the notion that we take the current extreme condition we're in now and generalize about that for the future.
Project to the future.
Yeah, and just, project it as a permanent condition in the future. Climate change is a much more projectable and long-term problem for urbanists, which has to be solved by building differently. Can I respond to the earlier part of your question too? Because about the uses of disorder, which is a book that's just been republished. I wrote it when I was young, and people still seem to get mad at it and read it. It has to do with something which you mentioned, the word best practices. And I took aim in that book at the idea of best practice. There is no one best practice. And in the planning work, when I was a consultant for the UN in the days when I was actually doing practical planning, I tried to make an alternative, which is, most of the work I did was in very poor communities, to show people who may not have an idea about what the alternatives of building a school or a health clinic look like, to make different models for them. Actually, we made them physically out of styrofoam. And to say, look, each one of these has pluses and minuses. We're disappearing now, we planners. You decide what you want and then come back to us. It was, people said, well, we want the answer. We want the best practice. This is disordering how we think about things. We have to talk to each other. We have to vote, argue with each other, and come up with a solution. That's, to me, a much more democratic way of planning than imposing on people best practices. And I think it has been a disease in the UN that what we propose as policy has that false notion of concreteness of this is what you should do. That's very wrong. You should do something which is more disordering in order for the public, which is you have alternatives and you have to choose. And we, as experts or people with knowledge, can see what those alternatives should be. And I would hate to see us go forward as a body in the UN as saying, this is what we recommend. That's a word that should be banned, the word recommend. And we'll never really find a way to engage people in the processes of sustainability unless they take ownership over it. And they can't take ownership over a best practice. So
absolutely. No, I agree with you. I can't remember. I use the word best practice, but I'm in the UN, but we don't use the word best practice. So I don't know that we use practices, in general. But I make a point about dialogic practices that develop from a dialogic engagement. I think that's really important.
Which is disordering, confusing. That's a good thing.
Well, I think it's, the importance of disordering is also very important to discuss in the context of the Euro-Mediterranean region, because when you look at the historic cities, they are fundamentally disorderly. And that's the reason that they're seen, when you look at the Corbusian city, the model, Frank Lloyd Wright model, very orthogonal, all laid out. It's what we aspire for is orderliness in the city. And so when we plan new interventions now, we want it to work like a machine perfectly. And the disorderliness of this dialogue city, where you have mixed, as you said, the inequalities, the different groups, it's a little bit disorienting. How are we bringing these two together? How do you think we can reimagine a city that, how do we think in an orderly way about disorderly cities?
Well, this is actually the problem, exactly the issue that I just published a new book with a student of mine about this, and in terms of which the book is called Infrastructures for Disorder. And what we're thinking about is ways in which the infrastructure of cities, particularly their high-tech infrastructure, can be designed in such a way that various possibilities, if you like, above ground, various forms of usage can be adapted by these technologies for water use, for electricity, as well as for social communication. Most of the technological grids, this is work we're doing at MIT, that we have are distributional. That is, you start with an overall resource and you distribute it. And there is a different way of designing cities where, which are demand-based, and in which different parts of the city have to collaborate and compete with each other for resources which can be made available to all. We're very interested in this, for instance, in cities which don't have enough electricity, about how simple ways of programming could allow people to negotiate for the uses they need at particular times of the day. That's an infrastructure for this disorder, which I mean by which I mean what you mean, which is dialogical. So my notion about this, and that the notion that we've put in this book based on this research at MIT, is how we could reimagine infrastructure as making negotiation above ground work. And it's an alternative vision to the kind of smart city planning like Songdo in Korea, which is entirely top down. And what that has to do with historic cities, I couldn't tell you, but tell me.
No. I mean, they evolved organically. They were fundamentally divergent in some ways because a lot of them did not. They started out, there were some elements that were top down for sure, but there was a lot of the fabric that emerged over time, and there was a lot of negotiation. Make a little room and find the way.
So one of the most interesting things about Roman aqueducts, for instance, is that the whole notion, there are a whole set of laws in ancient Rome about how to tap into these aqueducts so you get your water from them. There is no overall law. For us, this was a guiding issue about this. And from year to year, even under the worst dictators, worst emperors, people were constantly renegotiating who could tap into these water aqueducts and who couldn't. And we need to think about that in terms of electricity sourcing and also Wi-Fi speeds. It is a technical problem, but it's a technical problem built on, as you say, on knowledge that need is developed locally up, not determined top down. And but that wasn't the 20th century, and it still isn't the way in which smart cities like Songdo or some cities in the Gulf are thinking about how to reconcile technological resources with social usage. I think this is very fruitful, maybe very fruitful area for you to pursue as well on the social side of this.
Let me ask you to respond a little bit more on the social point that you raised earlier, which is on the inequalities that especially the current COVID situation has revealed, these sort of stark inequalities, and you talk about that. So when we look at, as you were saying, you can design infrastructure to support disorderliness in the city, to support dialogue in the city. But how do you design communities that are more inclusive, especially in the Euro-Mediterranean region? What would you do? How can you order inclusiveness?
Can't you ask me a simpler question? I tell you what, when I was planning commissioner in New York, I'll tell you what I focused on. This is not a whole answer by any means, but it's the answer that I pursued, which was that inclusion starts with physical presence. And if you are abstractly connected to somebody else, everybody says, oh yes, I'm not a racist, I believe in classes meeting with each other and so on. That's very easy to write down or to tweet. And my thought was, how do you actually make that an experience? What I did in New York with, not alone, certainly with many other people, was to look at, since we were such a segregated city, to look at doing planning on the periphery, on the edges between different segregated communities. For instance, we took Spanish Harlem, one of the poorest areas in New York in the 90s, and we tried to put resources, schools, a clinic, a market, on a street where Spanish Harlem suddenly meets up one of the richest communities in the world, which is the Upper East Side. To make that edge something where people, to go shop for milk or to get a flu shot, were in the presence of people who were different. And what I'd like to see in places like Rio, Sao Paulo, Mexico City, and so on, is much more working at the edges between communities rather than focusing on the centers of them. And that's got a sociological aspect to it, which is we put so much emphasis on community identity. It was another one of those terrible cliches of the 20th century, that when you're not in the space, which is not your identity, you're lost. And it's got the terrible thing that you should live where you belong. You know, that identity is also a form of ghettoization. So we were interested in places where people, say, in going to a store, didn't relate as a Latino person, going into the same store as a gentleman dressed in a suit or a lady dressed in mink. They were just all buying milk. And their identities were suspended in these peripheral porous zones. We thought of it as planning for the membrane rather than for the nucleus. And as I say, there's a very partial solution, but it comes out of my profound distrust of people who put their hands up and say, I am not a racist, but never see blacks. You know, this is, it's too easy. So that's again where I think, and that's again a problem of you have to have enough diversity and density in the city to do that. You can't do that in a suburb where everybody is the same. Periphery is not a meaningful matter edge. You need to abut these differences which have developed.
It's these serendipitous encounters that you really put a lot of value on. It's not necessarily the organized it's a way.
Right.
Let me ask you about public transport, because that kind of now, you know, everybody is extremely worried about the situation because, well, I mean, you can look at public transport from many perspectives. One is the current COVID situation, but also in terms of climate change and mitigation, looking at increasing ways to have public transport as opposed to private transport, reducing cars, as you said, greenhouse gas emissions. Looking at compact cities, walkability, you know, all of those aspects being important. And again, we have, of course, historically received many examples of dense, walkable cities. But those aren't necessarily, you know, if you're looking at big factories, you're looking at production, you know, how do we make all of this work? What are your thoughts on how we can imagine or reimagine cities and transport here on?
As I say, why don't you ask me simple questions?
I know, I shouldn't I? I tried. Tried to ask you about the weather, about where you were. I'm trying to give you a little easy time.
Well, one of the things that I know about this is that in a lot of the highway building that we've done, that we've squandered an opportunity to build cheap public transport, like small-scale light railways or trams, because a lot of this highway development is so expensive and so car intensive that actually putting in public transport in it is very difficult. Bogota did that a long time ago, tried to mix the two forms of transport. It worked pretty well for a while, but I think we need new kind of models for doing this. That's why I'm so seduced by Anne Hidalgo's notion of reducing the scale and whereas keeping the density. What is happening at MIT about that is looking at ways that, and this is a physical project, that you can build people movers of 10 to 12 people cheaply, in which people can socially distance in the people mover. And it's a technological problem because of the kinds of engines you build and so on, but it's a new form of public and the materials that are used. But it's a new form of public transport model, which says that the ideal is not the subway car of 132 people modally, but it's a vehicle which is electric or hydrogen powered, which takes 10 to 12 people, very mobile and very cheap to build. And I think we'll find a model for that. The target is that it should cost no more than $18,000. And that's, you know, it's a very specific thing we're trying to do. That is affordable. You know, it could be built. India could use it, you know, but it doesn't exist yet. The models that exist for the transport of that type are very technologically very primitive, and they're breeders of disease. So that's a kind of, it's kind of blue sky thinking that I think we need to do. And there's no best practice for doing that. This is a project that has wasted hundreds of thousands of dollars. Nobody said, okay, do this, you know exactly what to do, tell us what to make. I mean, you know, the whole thing about urbanism is that it's a laboratory science. It's not a theoretical science. But we don't credit the laboratory part of it, and in my view, enough.
No, I mean, taking the laboratory idea and just to sort of dwell a little bit on points that you're raising, you know, what if we were to look at the community as a source of the solution for transport? So, for example, instead of thinking about mass transport in terms of metros and buses and such, if you had trams and small jitneys and all such, and you had the 15-minute city or a little bit bigger than 15-minute city, and you had all these sorts of modes of transportation which were diverse, but they benefited local communities. Are those sorts of solutions workable, do you think, in this kind of a model of urban development?
Sure, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the thing about a transport network is that we took the model. It's a model actually based in military planning in the US in the 1950s, which has become naturalized as a model for highway building, about moving the maximum number of large-scale vehicles at the greatest possible speed. That's a military model, and we've got to get out of that. And the model is built into our bodies. I'm sure most of you are like me, that when I'm stuck in traffic, I'm like this, you know? But if you lived in one of your historic cities in 18th century, the notion of traveling slow was not something that caused this kind of thing. The idea that speed is a goal of urban planning is something that really, it begins with Haussmann, but it's really something in the 1950s, which is an adaptation of military movement to the city, and it shouldn't be. So, very hard to convince people of that, but because it's in their bodies. But we need slower cities, you know, those are more sustainable. And this is an issue, but if I may remark, I have many planner friends in China who built that model of that speed was the goal of urban design. And now they're coming really to regret it, because they can't deal with problems, the very difficult problems of transport and transport pollution that they have on a highway. It requires a different kind of transport network, which is more additive, you know, in which you add capacity from the community up.
All right. Well, I think we have to open up soon to people who might have questions, but I want to ask you one last question about tourism, because tourism has been, and you talked about this right in the beginning, and you talked about densities and not making cities for tourists, making it for local residents and so on. But and you've written about this as well. But I think you know, when you look at, especially if you're looking at World Heritage cities, or you're looking at, you know, historic cities, and certainly in the Mediterranean, tourism is a huge pull, and suddenly it's come to a halt. So how can we reimagine tourism, and how can we reimagine these the role of color and heritage beyond tourism?
Well, I think this is a great moment for cities that have lived on tourism to rethink how much of it they want. They've become places like Barcelona have threatened to become monocultures. And certainly much of New York has become a monoculture on tourism. And I think the fact that this has all collapsed is the moment to rethink about other ways to rebuild a city which are not so dependent on it. My own view, and this is just a personal view of mine, means that means disprivileging international forms of investment in the hospitality industry, restricting the number of Starbucks, certainly getting rid of the rental stuff for short-term rental markets and so on, as Barcelona has done. But this has destroyed cities, this monoculture, and this is a really good moment to think about restricting it, which means that you want to try and build up local businesses that provide hospitality instead. One of the saddest things about mass tourism is that mass tourists don't tend to use local places. They see a Starbucks and they make straight from the boat off the Grand Canal for the nearest Starbucks. It's a disaster. And the same thing true in London. I'm on camera now, just a second. Sorry, this is our house, so. My wife is actually a much better urbanist than I am.
We know very well her work.
But I mean, I think this is something where the restraint of the internationalization, the globalization of tourism has to start. And this is the right moment to do it. It's, you know, the whole thing about heritage is that heritage is a way, as you know, is a way in which you can make a business. But like any business, it should be limited. It shouldn't become the ways in which a city gets more and more people from abroad. The other thing I am about heritage, since you asked me about this in cities, I was very supportive of the proposal in Venice for a tourist tax on people who stay in the city for less than 3 days. People are more likely to use the city and leave money in the city if they stay there more than 3 days than if they are in Venice. The problem was people slept on their ships. They went into the city, they bought, you know, masks or whatever, and then they left. The city got very little out of it. So one of the ways of actually getting people to use the city is getting them to stay there. But more important, this is a great moment to rethink this monoculture and to combat it. And combat it by essentially, as I say, limiting the capacity of these international shops to colonize the tourist economy.
To have more local, sort of more sustainable models for us.
Yeah, but a more sustainable model means that people have to be there longer. They have to be, as the 19th century called them, visitors rather than tourists. And they have to visit, you know? And
Right.
what we're including, tourism is opposed to visiting in that sense. I mean, I'm quite an extremist on this. I don't like guided tours. I would take down many of those headphone sets in museums that tell people what to do and where to go. You want to discover when you're a visitor. You want to make your own discoveries rather than be forced into this kind of mold. But it is a problem, and the whole heritage setup in UNESCO has unfortunately been complicit in that, you know? So anyhow.
All right, well.
Another discussion.
I think we have to open up a little bit to see there's lots of questions on the side, and I wanted to see if we could perhaps take a few questions. So I'm just going to call on some of the people who have been asking some questions on the side. So let me see, I think there is Lasana Sise first. Lasana Sise, please, would you like to take the floor?
Hello.
Yes.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui, allez-y,
Bonjour.
allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Oui, je parle français, donc.
Vous m'entendez?
Oui.
Oui, allez-y, allez-y.
Bonjour, est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Oui, oui, oui.
Oui, oui, très bien.
Bon, moi, je ne vous entends pas, malheureusement. Donc, non, j'ai envoyé déjà deux questions qui me paraissent importantes dans le lien entre le sud et le nord de la Méditerranée. C'est le problème de migration. La migration constitue un problème pour les villes.
Ah oui.
Bien du côté Maghreb que Méditerranée du côté européen, Italie, Espagne, etc. Alors, il y a la pandémie actuellement. On sait que ces jeunes qui migrent là, ceux qui arrivent à atteindre l'autre bord ou qui restent, qui n'ont pas pu aller, ils squattent des espaces publics. Alors, quelle stratégie pourrait-on développer pour vraiment gérer cette question qui est beaucoup prise en compte par l'Organisation internationale des migrations, l'OIM? Quelle stratégie? Parce qu'en termes de pression démographique, anthropique, c'est véritablement un problème. Bon, je ne vais pas parler de ce que les migrants subissent dans des villes, vous connaissez le cas de la Libye et même du Maroc. Il y a beaucoup de cas graves, hein, des cas graves d'atteinte.
Oui, oui, j'entends. Bon, je vais répondre en anglais si vous permettez. Bon, vous m'entendez? Oui, vous me comprenez?
We have interpretation, so no
Ah,
problem.
fine. Oh, good, good. Mon français, je peux tirer d'affaire, mais c'est quand même c'est faible. So I tell you what this has, what the issue that we've been dealing on this, which is perhaps very familiar to you, which is that we've made projections. I can actually show you on the screen what the sécheresse in the Sahel and the Sahara is going to do to migration to cities. We are having a rapid drying up of the semi-arid regions around the Sahara and in the Sahel, which is driving people into cities. Our projections are that the drive is more northward than southward, that is not into Central Africa, but into the Maghreb and into those cities, and from those cities, as you well know, into attempts to reach Europe. So you can have within 5 years somebody who has been a skilled agricultural worker, who is somebody in Rome who has no economic place. Very familiar to all of us. The problem for the UN is this, and this is a problem that a group that I'm involved in is working with. These climate change refugees have no status as refugees. Under the terms of the 1951 Refugee Act, you are a refugee only if you have a well-founded fear of being attacked or of being persecuted when you return to your home country. Which means that even the small amount of money that we have for refugee relief is not, as the law stands currently, available for refugees from climate change. And one of the things I think that UN needs to do in the next 5 years is renegotiate the treaties that begin with the Geneva Treaty of 1951, so that this well-founded fear of persecution is not a measure of, as you all know, our resources are low, they're limited, but there are some. And once somebody can get a legal status as a refugee from the UN by virtue of having been displaced by desertification, by sécheresse, it might be possible to give them ways of having civic standing in cities which they can't have because they're treated now as migrants rather than refugees. This is a particular issue in London because we would like to give people who are displaced from the land civic passports, even though the British government will not give them UK passports, but at least some kind of papers belonging to a city based on the fact that they can't go home, but not because they're persecuted, but because climate change has erased their home. So this is a very particular problem in the UN, and this autumn is the 75th anniversary of the UN, and I hope this is a relaunching, reopening of the 51 Geneva Convention. I'm hoping that that will be one of the activities we take in the 75th observance of the United Nations. I can't hear.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you very much. I had my microphone on mute. So we have Adele Sessi, who's, if you can take the next question. Adele Sessi, would you like to ask your question?
Hello. Thank you very much for this very interesting presentation. And I put on the table 2 questions, but I'm interested in the second one in particular, because as far as I understood, the idea is in finding solution for this, for all challenges. The idea is to producing a disorder, putting together all the components of the table. And but don't you think that probably each of the represented should have a specific role, in particular between needs and solution or approaches? Which is the role of communities and people, and which is the role of experts and competent persons in this dualism? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Actually, if it's okay with you, Richard, I'm going to take a few more questions so that we can collect a few questions.
Okay.
Have you, because we have quite a few people who seem to be interested, so if that's okay with you. So next, we maybe take three. So next we have Olympia Nigelo, or Niglio. I'm sorry, I'm mispronouncing your name. Olympia Niglio. Hello, Olympia Niglio. Are you there? No. Vincent Magri. Please go ahead. Vincent Magri. No. Then I move to the next, which is Marc Dader. Marc Dader.
Hi, hello. Can you hear me?
Yes, please
Yes.
go ahead.
Okay. Hello to everybody. It's a privilege listening to Mr. Sennett for me. I would like to address him just a question. History of urbanism has shown us how health has been a catalyzer for urban transformations. Several experiences can prove this statement. The 19th century city extensions like Haussmann in Paris or Cerdà in Barcelona, or the 1916 zoning resolution law in New York City, or even the hygienicist approach of modern movement after the Charter of Athens in the Siam IV. Some breakthroughs, such as sewerage system, the openness of public spaces, the height regulations have been incorporated to urban planning after dealing with health issues. What will, in Mr. Sennett's opinion, will remain in urban planning after the current pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we have one more, Mohammed Al-Bari. Please excuse me if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly.
Okay.
Mohammed Al-Bari.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
go ahead.
Okay. So thank you, dears, for this wonderful conversation. I'm talking to you from Japan, Tsukuba University. So my question is about the role of uncontrolled heritage conservation and which result in touristification in world heritage sites. How can we maintain a balance between place identity of historic districts in these sites and tourism development? Thank you so much.
Okay, I might have to say something about this as well, because I'm not so clear that this is a World Heritage property you're talking about or another, but we'll come back to it. So please, we have three questions. Richard, over to you.
Okay. Well, let me take the second question first about what will remain from this COVID crisis. I think our discussion has shown that we shouldn't be taking the moment we're in now as a model for what's going to happen in the future. Things are going to look very different when we have more medical means. I think, unfortunately, what will remain is the economic consequences of this. To me, what is most striking economically about the pandemic is that it reveals how short-term and fragile much of the world economy is. That here in Britain, for instance, and I'm sure this is true everywhere, there are many, many businesses which are going broke because their margin for survival was at most a month's resources, that they hadn't the means to survive something that lasted 3 months. And it is, I think, that that economic consequence is going to disable economies for, the prediction here is 7 years, but even if it's 4, that's a very long time. So I think what urbanists need to focus on is not so much the medical side of this, but on the economic consequences of this. It shows how fragile much of modern capitalism is, how thin is the margin of survival. And it should be for the UN the essence of sustainability. Sustainability means you go on long term. And what we're seeing is an economy that isn't very sustainable in that time frame. So that's to me where I think we should be focusing. On this question of expertise is so difficult. You know, I'm a good socialist. You know, I believe everybody has an equal dignity and so on. But expertise is expertise. And the question is how to treat people who don't have your expertise with respect. And conversely, how people can rely on you without feeling demeaned or humiliated or inferior to you because they don't know what you do. And that's why in our planning practice, we tried to make alternative models and then say, it's up to you. It's your life, not our life. And have people discuss and debate themselves. It's not disorder in the sense of saying, you know, you'll never get anywhere, this is just pure process. But it is a moment of saying, my God, we have to do this for ourselves. It is dialogical. Could I say, by the way, just one thing about disorder? All dense, complicated environments are disorderly. It's a systematic property of any kind of multi-factor system, that the more elements you put in it, the more randomicity is induced in the system. It's true of computers, it's true of fluid mechanics, and it's true of human beings. So that if a city gathers a lot of different kinds of people together and puts them up close, you're going to have that systematic property of disorder. The only way you can order it is by having top-down controls. And that is that the remedy for complexity is tyranny. And that's, we don't want. So there is a measure in any open system, which has got complex factors of being, it's unbounded in systems terms. But that's just the professor in me speaking to you. About the tourism, if I understand your question right, was about Hagia Sophia? Is that what you're worried about? That this is no longer a public space?
Sorry. Can I make it clear?
Yes, please.
Yeah, some conservation projects, the inputs of these projects are different than the outputs. So in some areas, like in historic Cairo, for example, some of the projects that implemented by local government and as well as United Nations development projects, the outcomes of these projects had negative impact on the identity of places, because these conservation projects mainly targeted the buildings. It's mere archaeological restoration or rehabilitation.
Yeah, I think this is a question you should address to Jyoti, not to me. I know the problem you are raising. Let me put it that way. Maybe, Jyoti, this is a good way to end. You should address that.
Well, I will be very brief because I think there's a few other people who have questions they want to raise, and maybe we could take a few more minutes we could go for another 15 minutes. Is that right, Victoria, Isa?
I think yes, I think it's okay.
Okay. So just very quickly, I think that the case of Cairo, of course, is a complicated case. But I think in general, when you have a situation, and I don't know that this project was something that UNESCO was involved in, but in general, we always, the fundamental approach of World Heritage is to engage local communities, and it's never about emptying places. From sort of vacating the local communities to somehow embalm buildings, freeze them. Absolutely not. In fact, the idea of good conservation is the opposite, that they should be living, thriving places, and that the local communities continue to manage them. We have them because local communities have handed them down to us over the generations. So it's for us to find ways to keep them in precisely some of the ways that Richard has been talking about, by being able to address the pressures of urbanization and development on them. So I honestly am not sure if there were certain specific projects that you're talking about. I'd be happy to address this separately in terms of the specificities of project, but they should normally, if you engage local communities, you wouldn't have such a problem where the local people don't feel their identity was, or the local people feel their identity was taken away. That means they probably weren't as engaged in the solutions that developed, and we would definitely encourage that those solutions include local people. So I will stop there on the response to that, and look for the next three, and that will be the last three I think we can take. So we have Riyad Haj Said from Tunisia, I think, and Medani from Eritrea, and Rosabella Alvarez. So first, Riyad.
Bonjour, moi c'est Riyad de la Tunisie.
D'accord.
Voilà. Ma question, c'est l'explosion urbaine qui se fait aujourd'hui au niveau des tissus urbains traditionnels comme les médinas, classés patrimoine mondial, celle de la ville de Tunis ou la ville de Sousse, patrimoine mondial, et aussi la ville de Koroan. L'explosion urbaine, c'est aussi l'exode urbain aujourd'hui qui est excessive, et le venu d'autres habitants qui n'ont pas une idée de l'importance du patrimoine qui se trouve à conserver et à préserver. Alors ici, ma question, elle est aussi un peu critique par rapport à l'état du patrimoine. Est-ce qu'on doit conserver le cadre bâti par rapport aux nouveaux arrivés, ou bien il faut créer une nouvelle stratégie d'intervenir sur la restauration et la conservation du patrimoine qui est urbaine, quoi. Voilà, merci.
Okay, thank you very much. We take the second question from Medani. Are you there, Medani? No.
Okay.
Rosabella?
Yes.
Yeah, Medani?
Medhani.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Okay. Thank you so much for the floor you give me. So I would like also to express my thanks for all the speakers for very interesting topics and debating. My question is going to Professor Richard regarding to the densification is not the right urban model for cities. So if we look at many African cities are under pressure of population growth, affordable housing and transport, to support and informal settlement. So most cities are pursuing for densification urban model rather than more sustainable urban model. So what do you suggest for alternative urban development model for African context? One. Another question is how, historic cities, how can they balance economic, social, health issue versus sustainable urban conservation? This is the most challenging and complex issue. So that's my questions. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. We have one last question from Rosabella.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
please go ahead.
Hello, hello. So I'm from Lima, Peru. I'm an archaeologist and an urbanist. I'm really curious about what's the issue with Airbnb, because I understand that initially it had a lot of positive impact, especially when it was about people opening their homes to guests, and we quickly see how it has completely gone downwards to the point that some cities sought to restrict it. And even then in my city, I was actually evicted from a place because the owner wanted to turn it into an Airbnb. Right. So I actually had to go through it myself. So there's like some things like, do you think it was a question of lack of regulation, of how it grew without regulation, or if it was a question of the principle? And how do you envision a future where perhaps the spirit of Airbnb, what it originally intended to be, could be transformed into the post-pandemic? Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard, over to you.
Well, I'm going to answer the first two questions briefly together. They're enormous questions. So I give you a simple answer. And that is that to me, people's sense of patrimony should not be just its monuments. And that the kind of more ordinary spaces that are important to people should be protected. They are spaces that no tourist maybe will ever visit. A corner where local people hang out is part of our patrimony as citizens. Or a mosque or a church where people congregate is part of our patrimony, even if it has no archaeological or artistic value. So the notion that patrimony equals art is, to me, very misplaced. And the most fragile part of urban patrimony are its sociable spaces, which don't have the marker of being tourist visible art. And that relates to the second question, which is an enormous question, which will keep us here long past dinner, which is how do we treat the informal aspect of cities as sites for development? It's the prime question, I think, not just for African cities, but also for cities in Southeast Asia and for much of Latin America, which is the notion oftentimes is that, for instance, in barrios, that informally built settlements are developed when we tear those barrio structures down and put in something good that is permanent, that is not informal. That's the way the World Bank used to run up until 2012, that informality was anti-developmental. Now we know a lot more about that. We know that we need to do is help people in informal settlements live better lives, increase the resources they have to self-build, for instance, or to have access to schools or even to technical resources like water. Rather than, in other words, we should keep the informality as a fact of life for poor people and try and make that a better fact of life rather than erase the informality. This is the subject of my new book. So I hope you'll read it and you'll tell me what's right and wrong about it. About the third issue, can I just say that I agree with you. The original idea of Airbnb was wonderful, but it has become a nightmare. And I believe that basically the answer to that has to be very strict regulation where people cannot rent out the places they live for more than 6 months a year, that they have to live in them the other 6 months. That would destroy the Airbnb industry, and it would stop in its tracks the notion of building new residential structures which are only for Airbnb stuff. In other words, if you're going to use your house as a resource, it has to be your house. I can't see any other way. Regulating this industry is impossible. It simply has to go back to the notion that temporarily you are letting somebody else stay where you live, but that's where you live. So let me just say that I'm delighted you've asked me to join you for this webinar. And I hope it sparks questions for you as it has for me. And I'm very grateful to Ambassador Kamal and the entire team here, and to Jody Grahar to make this event possible. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you very much, Richard. You know, this was just I feel like it was just the beginning of a long conversation. There's lots more to talk about yet. We haven't even got to the European Green Deal. I mean, we have so many things to discuss. We need to plan many hours of conversation, but thank you so much for your willingness to share and for all the very thoughtful and thought-provoking responses, ideas. You know, you've sparked many things, many ideas, and we have a lot to think about and work on. And this is the moment. This is the moment for us to work. So I think this is absolutely perfect timing for that. So thank you very, very much. It was a real pleasure. And I will now hand the microphone back to Ambassador Kamal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, I have nothing more to add because this was an extremely enriching experience for me. I'm no expert. I'm the journalist here, but this very interesting thoughts and insight that were given by a world authority in the subject matter were extremely useful for me as Secretary General of the Union for the Mediterranean, and I'm sure it will be even more useful to my colleague, my dear Deputy Secretary General Aisha, who is in charge of urban development and transport, and also all the team that works with her. One important conclusion I gather, and I hope I'm correct, is that COVID should not really be the defining factor in our approach to urban development, because we are, either we like it, we're not going to live in big and dense cities in the future, but climate change is, and preservation of our heritage, both culturally and our social behavior within those large human colonies, if I may say so, is another important factor. So I will just express my gratitude. Thank you for enlightening me in a subject as important as this one, and hoping to be able to host you in collaboration with our dear colleagues in UNESCO in further answering many questions that I'm sure all the participants and new participants in the future will be asking from someone who has the depth of knowledge that you possess. So thank you very much, and hope to see you physically or virtually in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you.